Imagine waking up to find the largest battleship ever built is hunting you, and all you have to fight back is a handful of tiny escort carriers, a few destroyers, an aircraft so outdated that pilots called them relics from another era. Imagine watching 18-inch shells the size of Volkswagens splashing around your ship while you desperately try to launch aircraft that were never designed for this kind of fight. Imagine being so outgunned that your enemy's single battleship weighs more than your entire task force combined. Now imagine winning anyway. This is the story of Taffy 3, the battle off Samar, and the most lopsided naval engagement in American history. This is the story of how 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and a collection of FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers stood against the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy and refused to die. This is the story of ordinary sailors who became legends, of pilots who made strafing runs without ammunition, and of a victory so improbable that the enemy commander could not believe what was happening even as it unfolded before his eyes. On the morning of October 25, 1944, the fate of the Philippine invasion hung by a thread, and the men of Taffy 3 were the only ones who could save it. The disaster that nearly destroyed the American landings at Lake Gulf began with a decision made hundreds of miles away. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, had taken his powerful force of fast carriers and battleships north, chasing a Japanese carrier force that turned out to be a decoy. The Japanese plan, Operation Go, was working exactly as designed. While Halsey raced north to destroy empty carriers, the real threat was coming through San Bernardino Strait, completely unopposed. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled for a single operation. At its heart was the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, displacing over 72,000 tons and armed with 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, more than 25 miles. Alongside Yamato sailed her sister Considerations, along with the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers completed the force. It was a fleet designed to annihilate anything in its path. The previous day, Kurita's force had been savaged by American submarine and air attacks in the Sibian Sea. The super battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, had been sunk after absorbing an incredible amount of punishment. Other ships had been damaged, and Kurita himself had been forced to swim for his life when his flagship was torpedoed. But the center force remained formidable, and when American reconnaissance failed to detect its passage through San Bernardino Strait during the night, disaster loomed. Waiting on the other side of that strait, completely unaware of the danger bearing down on them, were the escort carriers of Taffy 3. These were not the fast fleet carriers that formed the backbone of American naval aviation. They were converted merchant ships and tanker hulls, slow, thin-skinned, and armed with a single 5-inch gun that was useful for little more than firing at surfaced submarines. Their mission was to provide close air support for the troops landing on Leyte, not to fight enemy warships. The very idea of escort carriers engaging battleships was absurd, suicidal, impossible. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3 from his flagship, the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. Under his command were 5 other escort carriers, St. Lo, White Plains, Callanan Bay, Kicken Bay, and Gambier Bay. Screening these vulnerable flat-tops were 3 destroyers, Hole, Heerman, and Johnston, along with 4 destroyer escorts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. It was a force designed for one purpose, and that purpose was not surface combat. The aircraft aboard these escort carriers were equally unsuited for the battle they were about to fight. The FM-2 Wildcat was an improved version of the F-4F Wildcat that had fought the first desperate battles of the Pacific War. By 1944, it was considered obsolete for fleet carrier operations, replaced by the faster and more powerful F-6F Hellcat. But the Wildcat was perfect for escort carrier duty, lightweight enough to operate from the small flight decks, simple enough to maintain with limited facilities, and still capable of providing effective close air support. The TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that shared the flight decks were more formidable, but they too had limitations. Many of them were armed that morning with bombs and depth charges intended for ground support missions, not the torpedoes that would have been ideal for attacking enemy ships. The pilots would have to fight with whatever they had. As dawn broke on October 25, the men of Taffy 3 had no idea that they were about to fight for their lives. The morning routine proceeded normally, with aircraft being prepared for the day's support missions, breakfast being served in the mess halls, and sailors going about their duties with the casual efficiency of men who believed they were far from any serious threat. That illusion shattered at 0645 when lookouts on the northernmost ships spotted something impossible on the horizon. Anti-aircraft fire, pagoda masts. The distinctive silhouettes of Japanese battleships and cruisers emerging from the morning haze like nightmares made real. The first reaction aboard the American ships was disbelief. This could not be happening. The Japanese fleet was supposed to be hundreds of miles away, blocked by Halsey's battleships. Some officers initially thought they were seeing friendly vessels, perhaps part of the 7th Fleet's bombardment group. That hope died when massive geysers of colored water began erupting around the escort carriers, the dye markers the Japanese used to help spot the fall of their shells, creating an obscene rainbow of destruction. Admiral Sprague's voice crackled over the radio. Calm despite the impossibility of the situation, he ordered his ships to turn east and make smoke, to launch all available aircraft, and to prepare for surface action. It was not much of a plan, because there was not much that could be done. The escort carriers could make perhaps 18 knots at maximum speed. The Japanese battleships could make 27. Mathematics guaranteed that the enemy would catch them, and when they did, the thin-skinned carriers would be torn apart. But Sprague was not ready to die quietly. He issued orders that would define the battle and save the invasion force. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were to attack the Japanese fleet, to buy time with their lives so that the carriers might escape. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. But without hesitation, the small ships turned toward the enemy and charged. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer Johnston did not wait for orders. Even before Sprague's command was issued, Evans had already turned his ship toward the enemy. Johnston was the first American vessel to engage the Japanese center force, and her actions that morning would earn her commanding officer the Medal of Honor. Evans was a Cherokee from Oklahoma, a career Navy man who had told his crew when they commissioned Johnston that they would never retreat from a fight. Now he intended to keep that promise. At flank speed, trailing a wake of white foam, Johnston raced toward the massive Japanese ships, her 5-inch guns barking defiance at enemies that outweighed her by a factor of 50. The disparity was almost comical in its extremity. Johnston displaced about 2,000 tons and carried 5 5-inch guns that fired shells weighing about 50 pounds. Yamato displaced over 70,000 tons and carried guns that fired shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds. A single hit from Yamato's main battery would have been enough to destroy Johnston completely. Yet Evans pressed his attack without hesitation. Johnston's torpedoes were her only real threat to the Japanese heavy ships, and Evans intended to use them. Closing to within 10,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Kumano, Johnston launched a full spread of 10 torpedoes. At least one found its mark, blowing Kumano's bow off and forcing her out of the battle. First blood had been drawn by the smallest ships in the American force. But the Japanese were quick to respond. As Johnston turned away from her torpedo run, she was hit by 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo and 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser. The damage was catastrophic. The after engine room was wrecked, taking half of Johnston's power. The after gun mounts were knocked out. Evans himself was badly wounded, losing 2 fingers from his left hand, but he refused to leave the bridge. Wrapped in bandages and bleeding freely, Evans continued to command Johnston as she staggered through the battle. The destroyer was crippled but still fighting, her remaining guns continuing to fire at any Japanese ship within range. When the other American destroyers began their torpedo runs, Johnston provided covering fire, drawing enemy attention to herself despite her desperate condition. The destroyer Hull followed Johnston into the attack, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger. Hull charged directly at the Japanese battleships, launching her torpedoes at the leading enemy vessels before being caught in a crossfire that should have destroyed her instantly. Shells from multiple Japanese ships smashed into the small destroyer, knocking out her engines, her guns, and her steering. But Hull kept fighting, her crew manning whatever weapons remained operational, firing at the enemy until the ship finally rolled over and sank. Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, made the third destroyer attack. Unlike Hull and Johnston, Heermann emerged from her torpedo run relatively intact, though she had come so close to the Japanese ships that at one point she passed within 4,000 yards of Yamato herself. The massive battleship had been forced to turn away to avoid Heermann's torpedoes, disrupting the Japanese formation and buying precious minutes for the fleeing carriers. The destroyer escorts joined the attack with equal courage and even less chance of survival. These were smaller and more lightly armed than the destroyers, designed for anti-submarine warfare rather than surface combat. Their 3-inch guns could barely scratch the paint on a Japanese battleship, and their torpedo loadout was minimal. Yet they attacked anyway. The Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, made the most celebrated charge. Copeland was an attorney from Tacoma who had joined the Navy Reserve, an unlikely candidate for the kind of heroism he was about to display. He took his small ship directly at the Japanese heavy cruisers, closing to point-blank range where even his inadequate guns could do damage. At ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than thousands, Samuel B. Roberts pumped shell after shell into the heavy cruiser Chokai. Her gunners were loading and firing so fast that the barrels of their guns began to glow red. When the ammunition hoists could not keep up, sailors formed human chains to pass shells to the guns by hand. The tiny destroyer Escort was credited with scoring dozens of hits on Chokai and possibly contributing to the cruiser's eventual destruction. But Samuel B. Roberts could not survive such close combat. Japanese shells smashed into her again, and a hit in the engine room finally slowed her enough that the enemy could concentrate their fire. The ship went down fighting, her guns still firing as she sank. When the survivors were finally rescued, less than half of the crew remained alive. While the destroyers and destroyer escorts sacrificed themselves in surface combat, the aircraft of Taffy 3 were attacking the Japanese fleet with everything they had. The FM-2 Wildcats, armed only with machine guns and whatever bombs they happened to be carrying, made repeated runs against the Japanese ships. When their ammunition was exhausted, they continued to make dry runs, diving on the enemy vessels to distract gunners and disrupt formations. Lieutenant Commander Edward DeGardy led his Wildcat pilots in these desperate attacks, knowing that their 50 caliber machine guns could not penetrate the armor of Japanese warships, but might suppress anti-aircraft fire long enough for the torpedo bombers to attack. Again and again the Wildcats dove through curtains of anti-aircraft fire, strafing bridge structures and exposed gun crews, making themselves targets to protect the more vulnerable Avengers. The TBM Avengers carried the real striking power, but many of them were not armed for anti-ship combat. Pilots dropped whatever they had, depth charges in general, purpose bombs that could damage superstructures but could not sink capital ships. Those who did have torpedoes made their runs with desperate courage, boring through anti-aircraft fire that seemed to fill the sky. One Avenger pilot, finding himself out of ammunition and unable to reload, continued to make attack runs on Japanese cruisers, diving on them as if he still had weapons. His plane absorbed hit after hit from anti-aircraft fire, but he kept pressing attacks until his aircraft was too damaged to fly. He finally crashed alongside a destroyer, his body recovered from the wreckage days later. The air attacks, though individually they could not sink the Japanese capital ships, had an effect far beyond their actual damage. They forced the Japanese to maneuver defensively, to break formation to avoid torpedoes, to devote attention to air defense, rather than pursuing the fleeing carriers. Every minute bought was a minute that brought the escort carriers closer to safety, closer to the rain squalls that might hide them, closer to the miraculous deliverance that no one dared hope for. Admiral Kurita, aboard the Yamato, was not having the battle he expected. He had emerged from San Bernardino Strait, anticipating a relatively easy run to the landing beaches, where his heavy guns would annihilate the transports and supply ships that were the lifeblood of the American invasion. Instead, he had found himself in a chaotic battle with an enemy that refused to act defeated. The smoke screens laid by the American destroyers made accurate gunnery difficult. The constant air attacks forced his ships to maneuver unpredictably. The torpedo attacks from the small American ships had already damaged or destroyed several of his cruisers. And through the smoke and confusion, Kurita could see the distinctive flight deck silhouettes of what he believed were fleet carriers, not the insignificant escort carriers they actually were. This misidentification would prove fatal to the Japanese attack. Kurita convinced himself that he had found a major American carrier force, the kind of target that would justify the losses he was taking. He did not realize that the carriers fleeing before him were thin-skinned converted merchantmen, that the destroyers attacking his fleet were sacrificing themselves in a desperate delaying action, that the entire force opposing him could have been destroyed in minutes if he had pressed his advantage. The chaos of battle fed Kurita's confusion. His flagship Yamato, maneuvering to avoid torpedoes, had become separated from the rest of the formation. Radio communications were sporadic and contradictory. Damage reports came in from cruisers that had been torpedoed or hit by air attacks. And always, through the smoke, those carrier silhouettes beckoned, promising a decisive victory if only he could catch them. For nearly 2 hours, the battle raged across the waters off Samar. The escort carriers fled east and then south, seeking the rain squalls that would hide them from Japanese guns. The destroyers and destroyer escorts continued their attacks until they were sunk or too damaged to fight. The aircraft made run after run until they had no ammunition, no fuel, no bombs, nothing left but the courage of their pilots. The escort carrier Gambier Bay became the only American carrier sunk by enemy surface gunfire in the entire Pacific War. Unable to escape the pursuing Japanese cruisers, she was hit repeatedly by shells that her thin hull could not resist. Her crew fought to keep her afloat, but the damage was too severe. She capsized and sank, taking many of her crew with her. The other carriers suffered damage but survived, their crews working frantically to fight fires and maintain speed. St. Lo took hits but remained operational, though her fate was sealed by a different threat. As the surface battle reached its climax, the first kamikaze attacks of the Philippines campaign began. A Japanese suicide plane crashed into St. Lo, its bomb penetrating to the hangar deck and triggering catastrophic explosions that destroyed the ship. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, just as the Japanese cruisers were closing for the kill, the impossible happened. At 09 Lowen, Admiral Kurita ordered a general withdrawal. The Japanese fleet, on the verge of annihilating the American carriers and opening the path to the landing beaches, turned around and retreated through San Bernardino Strait. To this day, historians debate why Kurita broke off the attack. He later claimed that he believed he was facing a much larger American force, that fuel considerations required him to withdraw, that his mission was to attack the landing beaches, and the carriers had been an incidental target. None of these explanations fully satisfies. What seems clear is that the desperate resistance of Taffy 3 had created an illusion of strength that did not exist. The aggressive attacks by the destroyers suggested a confidence that belied the Americans' true situation. The constant air attacks implied a carrier force much larger than 6 escort carriers. The smokescreens hid the true vulnerability of the fleeing ships. Kurita, confused and exhausted, made the decision that saved the American invasion. The aftermath of the battle off Samar was a mixture of grief and astonishment. The American losses were severe. 2 escort carriers sunk, along with 2 destroyers and a destroyer escort. Over 1,000 American sailors killed, with hundreds more wounded or captured. The small ships that had charged the Japanese fleet had paid a terrible price for their courage. But the losses could have been infinitely worse. If Kurita had pressed his attack, he could have destroyed all 6 escort carriers and then fallen upon the transports at late, potentially setting back the Philippine invasion by months. The entire strategic situation in the Pacific could have been altered by a Japanese victory at Samar. Instead, the invasion proceeded, the Philippines were liberated, and the war continued toward its inevitable conclusion. The men who fought at Samar were recognized with the highest honors their nation could bestow. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His body never recovered from the waters where Johnston went down. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copland of Samuel B. Roberts also received the Medal of Honor, one of the few recipients who survived to receive the decoration. Dozens of other sailors and aviators were decorated for their actions that day. The FM-2 Wildcat pilots who flew through curtains of anti-aircraft fire earned a special place in the legend of Samar. These were not the newest or fastest fighters in the American inventory. They were sturdy, reliable aircraft designed for a support role, not for attacking battleships and cruisers. Yet their pilots pressed their attacks with a determination that awed even the Japanese. After the battle, Japanese officers who had witnessed the American attacks spoke of being amazed by the courage of the small ships and aircraft that had opposed them. They could not understand why such a clearly outmatched force would attack so aggressively rather than simply fleeing. The concept of sacrificial defense was not foreign to Japanese military culture, but they had not expected to see it from Americans. The truth was simpler than cultural analysis might suggest. The men of Taffy 3 attacked because they had no other choice. Flight was impossible given the speed advantage of the Japanese ships. Surrender was unthinkable. The only option that offered any hope of survival, for themselves and for the invasion force they were protecting, was to fight. And so they fought, with everything they had, against odds that should have been insurmountable. Admiral Sprague, in his after-action report, wrote that the battle had been a contest between heaven and earth. He credited divine intervention for the survival of any of his ships, and many of the survivors agreed. The rain squalls that appeared at crucial moments, the confusion that seemed to grip the Japanese command, the almost miraculous accuracy of the American torpedo attacks, all of these seemed to suggest forces beyond mere human agency. But divine intervention works through human hands, and at Samar those hands belonged to sailors and aviators who chose courage over fear, duty over self-preservation, attack over retreat. The real miracle of Samar was the human spirit that animated those desperate attacks, the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. The lessons of the battle off Samar extended far beyond tactics and technology. It demonstrated that courage and determination can sometimes overcome material disadvantage, that the human element in warfare remains decisive despite advances in weapons and equipment. It showed that small ships, properly handled, can achieve effects far beyond what their specifications would suggest. For the pilots of the FM-2 Wildcats, Samar represented the ultimate test of their skills and courage. They had taken an aircraft considered obsolete for front-line service and used it to attack the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. They had made strafing runs on battleships, had dropped depth charges on cruisers, had dived through anti-aircraft fire that should have destroyed them, and many of them had survived to tell the tale. Admiral Halsey, whose decision to chase the Japanese decoy force had created the crisis at Samar, was haunted by the battle for the rest of his life. He never fully accepted responsibility for leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded, but he could not escape the knowledge that his absence had nearly led to catastrophe. Only the incredible courage of Taffy 3 had saved the invasion and perhaps his reputation. The Japanese center force limped back through San Bernardino Strait, having lost 3 heavy cruisers and failed to accomplish any of its objectives. Kureda's decision to withdraw remains controversial among naval historians, with some condemning it as an inexplicable failure of nerve and others defending it as a reasonable response to the confusing tactical situation. What is beyond dispute is that his retreat saved the American invasion and condemned Japan's last major offensive action to failure. In the decades since the battle, Samar has become a touchstone for discussions of courage, leadership, and the nature of heroism. The actions of ships like Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and the others have been studied in military academies around the world. The decision-making of commanders from Sprague to Evans to Copeland has been analyzed and debated. The battle has inspired books, documentaries, and endless discussions among naval enthusiasts. What emerges from all this analysis is a picture of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances and rising to meet them. The sailors aboard the destroyers and destroyer escorts were not special forces operators or elite warriors. They were young men from farms and cities across America, trained for naval service, but never expecting to face what they encountered on October 25, 1944. When the moment came, they did not hesitate. The pilots of the FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers showed similar courage in the air. They attacked targets they could not sink with weapons inadequate for the task, knowing that each run through the anti-aircraft fire might be their last. They continued pressing attacks after their ammunition was exhausted, making dry runs to distract enemy gunners. They crashed damaged aircraft alongside American ships rather than risk leading the Japanese to the fleeing carriers. The escort carrier crews, often dismissed as second-line sailors aboard second-line ships, proved themselves the equal of any fleet carrier crew. They fought fires and repaired damage under enemy fire. They continued launching and recovering aircraft despite taking hits. They maintained discipline and effectiveness in conditions that would have broken lesser crews. All of these men, from the admirals on the bridge to the seamen in the engine rooms, contributed to the miracle of Samar. They took a situation that should have been hopeless and turned it into a victory. They faced an enemy that outweighed and outgunned them by an almost absurd margin and forced that enemy to retreat. They wrote a chapter in naval history that will be remembered as long as men sail the seas. The battle off Samar stands as a testament to what human courage can accomplish against material odds. It is a story of sacrifice and determination, of leadership and initiative, of the indomitable spirit that refuses to accept defeat. The bent blade of Japanese naval power was turned back by men who should have been swept aside like leaves before a storm. Admiral Sprague, reflecting on the battle years later, remained amazed that any of his ships had survived. The mathematics of the engagement suggested total destruction for the American force. The Japanese had every advantage in firepower, speed, and numbers. Yet they were the ones who retreated, while the battered remnants of Taffy 3 lived to fight another day. The FM-2 Wildcats that flew that day became symbols of the battle's essential character. They were not the newest or fastest or most powerful fighters available. They were workhorses, reliable and sturdy but not glamorous. Yet in the hands of determined pilots, they became weapons capable of influencing the outcome of a major naval battle. They proved that it is not always the weapon that matters, but the warrior who wields it. Today, the waters off Samar are peaceful, giving no hint of the carnage that took place there more than 8 decades ago. The wrecks of the sunken ships rest on the ocean floor, slowly being reclaimed by the sea. The men who fought there are almost all gone now, their stories preserved in official records and personal memoirs, and the grateful memory of a nation they saved. But the lessons of Samar endure. When the situation seems hopeless, when the odds appear insurmountable, when retreat seems like the only option, The men of Taffy 3 offer an alternative example. They attacked when they should have fled. They fought when they should have surrendered. They won when they should have lost. The small ships that charged the Japanese fleet did not do so because they thought they could win. They did so because it was their duty, because the men depending on them needed time to escape, because honor demanded that they meet the enemy regardless of the odds. In their sacrifice, they achieved something greater than any tactical victory. They demonstrated the power of the human spirit to overcome material disadvantage through sheer force of will. At dawn on October 25, 1944, 6 escort carriers and their escorts faced the greatest surface Fleet Japan had ever assembled. By mid-morning, that fleet was in retreat, its mission failed, its commanders confused and demoralized. The small boys of Taffy 3 had accomplished the impossible, and their legacy echoes through naval history to this day. This is the story of the FM-2 Wildcat pilots and the men who sailed with them at Samar. This is the story of courage against impossible odds, of sacrifice in the face of certain death, of victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. This is the story that proves that in warfare, as in life, the spirit of those who fight can matter more than the weapons they carry. The Battle off Samar was more than a naval engagement. It was a defining moment that revealed what ordinary people are capable of when everything is on the line. The men who fought there did not think of themselves as heroes. They were sailors doing their jobs, pilots flying their missions, officers making decisions under impossible pressure. But in their actions that morning, they achieved something heroic that transcends the tactical details of the battle. When the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon, the men of Taffy 3 had every reason to despair. They were outgunned, outweighed, and outpaced by an enemy force that should have swept them aside without difficulty. But they did not despair. They did not surrender. They did not run without fighting. They turned toward the enemy and attacked. That decision, made in the desperate moments of a dawn engagement, changed history. It saved an invasion force. It may have shortened the war. It certainly ensured that the sacrifice of those who fell was not in vain. The small boys of Taffy 3, the destroyers and destroyer escorts and escort carriers that should have been no match for battleships, proved that courage is the ultimate weapon of war.